Okay, he's still getting up. All right, so we'll get started. Hi, this is Catherine Lambrecht, Chicago Foodways Roundtable. I am not joining you from the Chicago area. I'm joining you from Dongala, Illinois, 377 miles from my home. I'm going to be doing a talk here at noon, and the people here were very nice and allowed me to run a podcast before. So I'm at the local library, as you can see. So today our program is Leftovers, a history of food waste and preservation. I try not to waste food. It doesn't mean I don't waste food, because I certainly have. Like, I threw away a head of lettuce that I paid $1 for just the other day, and I felt really guilty about it. But at the same time, it was not in a consumable. It just had gotten it got ahead of me. Uh, but let me tell you a story that happened to a friend of mine. Her children got up in the middle of the night, sorted through her refrigerator, and removed all the food that had expired. And to make it really stick, they visited garbage cans around the town and threw stuff away there so their mom could not retrieve it. If those were my children, oh my God, they'd be in trouble. Because frankly, they threw away food that was fine. It was pickles and stuff like that. So this is not the stuff that just dies because it just turned June 4th. They have a long life, and so do many other things. So anyway, she woke up to a substantially emptied kitchen, which, like I said, I would have had a hissy fit about. But that's that family. So I'm going to turn this over to Eleanor Barnett, who is gracing us from Wales, as in the UK. So that's just thrilling. And by the way, if you don't mind, maybe post in the chat where you happen to be today, just so we get a sense of how far the reach is. In fact, may I tell you, we got a new member from Hungary the other day. I was stunned and elated. So anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Eleanor Barnett, who's going to talk about food waste. Or leftovers, I say, a history of food waste and preservation. And I'm going to remove myself from the spotlight. And Eleanor, you have the show.
Real. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It is so lovely to speak to other people who are interested in the wonderful world of food history. I suppose I should just introduce myself first. So, as you said, my name's Eleanor. I am a historian of food. I work at Cardiff University in Wales, although I do actually live back in England, just over the bridge. So I'm not as exotic as Wales, unfortunately. My kind of academic research focuses on the early modern era, um, and I write a lot about the links between food and religion in that era, colonization, lots of big themes. Use food as this amazing tool to kind of access everyday experiences, beliefs, identities from ordinary people in that era of history, rather than, you know, these generally you get these top down narratives about from kings and queens alone kind of thing. But today I'm talking about my book, which I shall show you here, which is called Leftovers, A History of Food Waste and Preservation. And this is much broader than the normal research I do, in that it starts in the Tudor era but goes right up to the present day, because obviously it's such a topical topic. And it's been such a joy for me to be able to connect history to the present day. So, yeah, so the impetus for this research came during the coronavirus pandemic. In the Western world, we are used here as well as in the States, I'm sure, to heaving supermarket shelves with rows and rows of brightly packaged branded products, right? But when COVID struck, the illusion of this kind of endless bounty was quickly shattered. Certain items of food went out of stock. Supermarkets placed limits on certain items of food, certain staples that we buy here in the UK, and images of empty supermarket shelves like this one on the left went viral. But at the same time, the news was full of images of food waste. You know, liters and liters of fresh milk were being thrown down the slurry pits as the demand from restaurants plummeted and as supply chains faltered, leaving no lorry drivers to come and collect the milk. And this picture is actually from Pennsylvania, but it was happening in the UK as well. And in the UK, we had the rather infamous pig cull, which meant that 100,000 pigs were just simply incinerated in the absence of abattoir workers to process the meat. So before the coronavirus pandemic, you know, I had a general understanding that we all waste food, right? We all waste too much. But in the context of worrying about our food supply, food waste suddenly seemed much more pressing or much more jarring, I suppose. And then I did some more research into the issue, finding that a third of the food that we produce globally goes to waste. And if all this needlessly discarded food were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world after China and the US. So fighting food waste is a huge part of the continuing, pressing modern fight against climate change. And the UN really has not long left at all to reach its target of halving food waste by 2030. And as an aside, it's not going to be able to do that, I would think. So as a historian then, and a historian of food, I sort of gave up what I was looking at, and I wanted to look at this issue. And I turned to the past to understand this pressing modern problem. You know, how did we become such a wasteful society? How did our ancestors avoid food waste through preservation, the reuse of their leftovers in the kitchen, and through recycling or otherwise disposing of their food scraps? What, if anything, can we learn about building a sustainable food future by looking back on history? So as I say, this was kind of the starting point for my book. But it's a journey that kind of took me from the Tudor kitchen to medieval streets lined with butcher's offal to that explores kind of the world changing inventions in preservation of the Industrial Revolution, the hidden history of Victorian street food sellers and scavengers, thrifty recipes of the World Wars, right up to the AI restaurants of the future. And as I say, it's been such a joy for me to be able to connect and talk to scientists and business people who are, you know, thinking about the future, and to kind of connect, you know, the future to the quite distant past. So in the time I've got this afternoon or this morning for most of you, I think, I'm going to just whiz through some of the key moments in what is obviously a complex, interesting and vibrant history. So I missed one. So now, as we'll see, mass food waste on the scale that I've kind of mentioned is a modern problem of the last sort of half century or so. By the 1970s, food waste had doubled in the UK compared to pre-World War II levels. But that's not to say that pre-modern people weren't concerned about food waste. So from at least the 17th century, we have this, we've been kind of reminded that willful waste makes woeful want. And that's a precursor to the now familiar proverb, waste not, want not. And I've just included here, because I think it's lovely, an example of that phrase being used on a Victorian bread plate, by which time the phrase had kind of migrated into waste not, want not, and was, you know, you find it on lots of different kitchenalia from the era. So beginning in the early modern era. In 1660, chef Robert May instructed his readers to form stiff pastry into the likeness of a stag that had been shot with an arrow, then to fill the pastry carcass with red claret wine to mimic its blood. Another dish at the feast was a cardboard and pastry battleship with model cannons that fired real gunpowder, and another was a castle made out of pastry with a moving drawbridge. May imagined that ladies at the feast would pluck the arrow out of the pastry stag, causing the wine to spill and soak the damask tablecloths. Delightful chaos would then ensue. He said the ladies would throw eggs at each other, only to find that they'd been emptied of their natural contents and then filled instead with fragrant rose water. And then there'd be this amazing mock battle between the pastry battleship and the castle. Live birds and frogs would hidden in gold gilded pies, would surprise dinner guests and cause the, he said, ladies to skip and shriek in glee. So this was the type of Christmastide feasting of the Tudor and Jacobean eras that May sought to recreate. And these kinds of lavish, wasteful feasts, presided over by a rather portly Henry VIII, I think continue to define our image of this era. But at the same time, years of poor harvests, especially in the 1590s, meant that more people than ever were falling into poverty and hunger. Pressures on food provisions were compounded by a 16th century boom in population and the rise of enclosure, which just meant that common land was being fenced off from pasture, so ordinary people couldn't graze their livestock. In just a few years, the price of flour nearly tripled, in turn, of course, affecting the price of ordinary people's daily bread. There were lots of riots that ensued, notably the Oxfordshire Rising of 1596, when 4 poor men met on Enslow Hill in Oxfordshire, and with at least 40 others, and kind of sought this rebellion and a march on London, protesting these much higher prices. And it wasn't just the poor who had to make do in such times. So that same year, Sir Hugh Platt published this recipe book on your left, which sought to educate middling and upper classes on how to eat more frugally. So things like making cakes out of sweet root vegetables in the absence of sugar, or using up stale grated bread in a hodgepodge, which is a kind of anything goes broth or soup. And even in the absence of famine, everyone in early modern England was aware of the seasonal booms and busts of the earth's provisions, having to make do over the colder winter months. So today, we use artificial light to trick hens into laying eggs all year. And we also use artificial insemination to keep cows pregnant and lactating, therefore, throughout the year. But in the Tudor era, there'd be few eggs and little milk over the winter. And while today we preserve our food really without even thinking about it by throwing it in the fridge or freezer, in pre-modern times, food had to be laboriously preserved by hand. So Tudor gentry women would spend many, many hours making precious fruit into marmalade and other kind of sugary preserves to ensure that they could, enjoy the spoils of summer and autumn without them going to waste. And they used to boil the marmalade-y paste, sugary paste, longer than we would today, and it would kind of stiffen and become this thicker paste, which was then sliced and molded. So perhaps like in this example, which is a recreation by the food historian Ivan Day, you'd have a lovely stag, perhaps a floral pattern, something like that. And oftentimes these kind of marmalade pastes would become appropriate New Year's Day gifts. And that's when they used to give their presents rather than Christmas Day. But of course, sugar was still expensive and beyond the reach of most. The poor still, of course, had to preserve their food and would have eaten a great deal of salted fish, especially over the long Lenten fast when flesh meat was banned. And we have this lovely lament from a 15th century schoolboy who jots it down in his journal at school. He says, "Thou wilt not believe how weary I am of fish, and how much I desire that flesh were come in again. For I have eat none other but salt fish this Lent, and it hath engendered so much phlegm within me." And when meat was back on the menu, it was much enjoyed in the form of pies. The outer casing, which was then known as the coffin, was a Tudor version of Tupperware, really, intended only to preserve and to protect the contents within rather than be eaten. And you can see in these details from two Jan Steen paintings how the contents would have been eaten with a spoon or with your hands. So how did early modern people view wasting food then? Well, a religious outlook was universal, and religious fervour, in fact, was heightened because of Henry VIII's well-known divorce issues, which led to the Reformation when England transitioned from a Catholic to a Protestant country. And it was food in the form of the bread and wine of the Eucharist that Christ in Christianity had chosen to represent his body and blood at the Last Supper. So it's perhaps unsurprising that food was understood within this religious framework as kind of the ultimate gift from God that sustained earthly life. And therefore, to waste food was sinful and immoral. So there's a couple of quotes here, like from Puritan churchman Richard Baxter, who wrote, "We must see that nothing of any use be lost through satiety, negligence, or contempt. For the smallest part is of God's gifts and talents, given us not to cast away, but to use as he would have us. The least crumb which can be saved be not lost," commanded another Puritan writer, Ezekiel Woodward, who said, "No, not a crumb." Still familiar to many of us today, early modern clergymen taught their parishioners of the feeding of the 5,000. So if you know your Bible, it's when Jesus goes to mourn the passing of John the Baptist. There's a large crowd that follows him, and Jesus managed to kind of miraculously feed the crowd on just 5 loaves and 2 fish. But according to the Gospels, at the end of the meal, Christ told his disciples to, quote, "gather the pieces that are left over, so nothing be wasted." And in the end, they collected 12 full buckets of leftover food. There's another biblical parable that was very widely taught on this topic, which is Dives and Lazarus, so the rich and the poor man, which again, perhaps you're familiar with. It's when the rich man is having this lavish feast, and the poor man, is begging for any scraps from the table. And in the end, of course, the rich man goes to hell and the poor man goes to heaven. And I just always want to share this plate because I think it's really beautiful example from the late 16th century. So these are called banqueting trenchers, and the idea was that it's plain on the other side, and you'd have your normally your sweet treats sort of at the end of your feast. And then once you finished, you would turn it over and there'd be some kind of religious or moralizing message on the back. And this, I think, is a particularly lovely example. And of course, the idea is that, whilst you're attending to your physical needs, you should not forget higher sort of religious and spiritual considerations. And in this case, and very often, the message is to think of those who don't have as much food as you, and to give any leftovers to them. So yes, what would you do with your leftovers if you were lucky enough to have any? Well, like Lazarus, in fact, the Tudor poor did wait at the gates of grand estates to receive the leftovers from lavish feasts. We have left over an ordinance of 1526 from King Henry VIII's court that required all food scraps and any dregs of ale to be distributed to the poor who would wait at the gates. They would be collected by an almoner in two buckets. And importantly, this was taken really seriously. So the almoner was under pain of imprisonment, and anyone in the court who didn't oblige and give up their leftovers to the poor would actually be expelled from court on the third count. So when William Harrison chronicled the food and drink of the English in 1577, he noted that when the nobility had, quote, taken what it pleaseth them from the table, the rest is reserved and afterwards sent down to the serving men and waiters who feed thereon in like sort. With anything left being bestowed upon the poor, which lie ready at the gates in great numbers to receive the same. So Harrison's quote also suggests that leftovers from large Tudor estates went to the employees, and that's also true. So, for example, in Queen Elizabeth I's royal household, there were workers who cooked meats in the so-called boiling house who would receive literally the dripping of fat from the roasts, and they'd even take home the grease, as they call it, the grease in the kettles and pans, as part of their payment for their labor. A waste product to those with plenty. These meat juices were reimagined to add flavor and nutrition to sauces and gravies for those workers who had less. And just to say that these larger houses, they functioned like businesses, so they would have many different food departments, endless waste products and endless reuses. So the lees, the leftovers from wine, sent to the sergeant who managed the royal cellars, which could then be used to impart flavor, more flavor into new batches of wine. It could be used to feed compost, or even in many different medicinal remedies. So it was mixed with wheat and sheep suet with a little handful of watercress to allay swelling. So yes, there are millions of these, I think, really fascinating examples of how waste products from these big Tudor estates were being reused. But even those from humbler backgrounds could donate their surplus. So instead of throwing it to the pigs, the whey left over from cheese making, for example, could become a drink called wig, which was popular among labourers who would toil, in the hot fields. It was kind of fermented until soured and then flavoured with herbs. And one cookbook from 1615 that I've got on the screen here describes housewives who distributed a similar drink, this time made from buttermilk, which is the leftover liquid from butter making. Those who distributed that to their poor neighbours, he said, would find profit, therefore, in a divine place. So food was precious in the Tudor era then, because in the absence of artificial refrigeration, it quickly wasted away. It was laboriously grown and preserved, was oftentimes in short supply, and because it was seen as this gift from God. Of course, there was waste. So I thought this was an interesting quote from John Beale, the scientific writer. During the Anglo-Spanish Wars of the 1650s, he said that he was really much troubled to see our usual waste, lamenting that there was no use made of the heads, tongues, or insides of sheep, no plums ever dried, nor pears, except in a few houses. But in general, this is the exception to the rule. In general, this was certainly not a wasteful culture. So in our search then for the beginnings of the modern throwaway culture, I want to jump now to the Victorian era and to Mrs. Beeton, with whom I think many of you will be familiar. So her famous book of household management was first published in 1861, when, for the first time in history, more people were living in urban environments than in the countryside. Fueled by the Industrial Revolution, of course, and the wealth that was pilfered from the empire, London at this time was a bustling, smoke-filled capital whose population had by the mid-19th century more than doubled from the figures from 1801, making it a metropolis of over 2.3 million people that exceeded any city in the world. And Beeton's book became this essential cookery book, and domestic guidebook as well, for the new generation of urban housewives who, for the first time, were separated from the traditional food production and preservation methods, like those that I've spoken about, that had, sustained their rural ancestors for generations. These new urbanites or suburbanites were no longer tied to the natural seasonal kind of bouts of plenty and scarcity as they had been for, or as we as humans had been for most of our history. And food in the industrial era was no longer exclusively regional. So there's lots of, just a huge boom in technology in this era. But of course, a really key one is the advent of the railways. So just one example is that because of the railways, it was no longer profitable to peddle eggs into central London from neighbouring farmland, and instead they were brought, en masse all the way from France and Belgium. So in the first edition of Mrs. Beeton's book, that's again 1861, we find just one reference to a refrigerator. In the 1907 version, this number had multiplied to 10. These, of course, weren't the electronic refrigerators like we have today, but ice boxes. So there's an example here on the right. These were these wooden cabinets with walls lined with zinc, insulated with felt or slag wool or asbestos. And then they'd have this separate section that was topped up with ice, routinely. The power of cold to preserve was also being employed on steamships in this era. So the first successful shipment of chilled meat received Queen Victoria's royal seal of approval in 1875. And the beef she tasted then had come all the way from the New York abattoir of Timothy Eastman. And his method, which was, of course, very primitive of the time, simply involves fanning cold air from these huge slabs of ice, which took up about a quarter of the ship's capacity. But after that, experiments in producing artificial refrigerating machines on ships really took off, and actually very quickly had great success. So by 1900, nearly half of all the lamb and mutton eaten in Britain was being imported, and most of that was coming all the way from the other side of the world, from Australia and New Zealand, where they had an excess in sheep population, and where they literally would just bury carcasses of sheep because they just had too many. And soon, new exciting foods were being transported across the world out of season. So after discovering the delights of the banana in the Canary Islands, London-based grocer Edward Fyfe began importing Cavendish bananas into Britain in the 1880s. But his business really took off after 1901, when he bought artificially refrigerated ships, and that meant that he didn't have this huge fear of, obviously them going to waste and browning too quickly on the journey over. And of course, if you haven't guessed, that's where the banana company Fyfe's kind of originated. And I think it's, so interesting to imagine what that would have been like. Most Europeans would never have heard of a banana before. So imagine what it would have been like to eat a banana for the first time. It's a bizarrely yellow fruit for people who live in colder climates. It's kind of creamy, it's sweet. So it was opening up this whole world of food out of season for the British public. And this, of course, was, it was the start of the global cold chain, which today means that we can have food from across the world whenever we want it, preserved in a chain of refrigerators. Another monumental advance in food preservation is the tin can, and that was also changing the world in the 19th century. It was invented as a response to Napoleon's call to find a way of preserving food in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, when supplies of sugar were being cut off from the New World. And the French government then offered this prize, I think it was 12,000 francs, for anyone who could find a way of feeding their sailors and their army through preservation. And it was Nicholas Apert who did so in 1810, when he published this method of applying heat to bottles to seal them of air, essentially. From London, very quickly after that, Donkin, Hall and Gamble, three men acquired the patent for the similar technology. And in 1813, they opened the first purpose-built factory of the tin cans in the world in London. These weren't like the tin cans well, not quite like the tin cans we have today. So up to 20 pounds, so about 20 times heavier than the kind of tin of baked beans or whatever you have, and tomatoes in your cupboard. And they didn't actually have tin openers until a little bit later, which leads for some funny stories. But anyway, tin cans were soon sent around the world to feed the Navy in explorative and colonizing missions. So on his third attempt to traverse the Northwest Passage, which connected the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, Captain William Parry's ship, the Fury, became trapped in the wilderness there, and the crew had to dump their supplies, basically. But another Arctic explorer, Sir John Ross, found Donkin's cans still fresh when his ship also became wrecked 4 years later. So it was really changing the world of global travel. And by 1907, the second edition of Mrs. Beeton's book, canned vegetables, tinned tomatoes, and tinned fruits like pineapple chunks and peaches were already recognizable store cupboard ingredients, much as I think they still are today. So, though it of course helped food from going to waste, all this new technology of the 19th century was distancing Mrs. Beeton's readers further from the closed agricultural societies of the past. So, homemade pickles and preserves that used up leftovers and surplus were slowly being replaced with ready-made mass-produced versions that could now be bought off the shelf from the grocers. So although Mrs. Beeton looked back on the kind of wistfully on the wholesome traditional preservation techniques of the country housewife, even in the original first edition, she's already kind of reaching for the sort of packaged shortcuts of the industrial age, noting that pickles could be purchased for a cheaper price than supposedly superior homemade versions. And this slide is just to show the example of ketchup. So housewives from the 17th century had created mushroom or fishy ketchups, or they were more often known as catsups, based on similar sources that they'd encountered in Southeast Asia. And the example on the right is a mushroom ketchup or catsup that I made, and that is one of the historical recipes in my book. Completely delicious, by the way. We should bring it back. But by the mid-19th century, tomato versions were becoming more popular. And of course, in 1876, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, an American company launched Heinz tomato ketchup, bringing that to the British housewife in 1886. And as I say, therefore, slowly sort of killing off the home made preserves, homemade ketchup. By 1888, too, a thick meat extract made from Argentine beef had been introduced into British homes in its soon-to-be iconic red label jar. I'm not sure if do American people know about Bovril? I don't know. It's very kind of iconic here.
Not so much here.
Not so much. Okay, well, probably a good thing. Some people love it, but it's a bit of love-hate. But it was the creation of John Lawson Johnston, who was a Scottish entrepreneur working in Canada, who had supplied the French army with millions of cans of Johnston's fluid beef during the 1870s as a novel way of preserving and transporting meat. In the Victorian household, Bovril was this quick flavouring for sauces and gravies and stews. But the working classes had been used to making their own beef tea from their meat scraps and gravy. But once Bovril came along, all you needed was water and you had instant beef tea. Again, removing that need to make a product at home with leftover ingredients. Reusable stoneware jars, pots and bottles of early years are occasionally discovered by archaeologists, but the Victorians left behind mountains and mountains of disposable glass bottles and tin cans, all marked with the logos of these emergent brands. So you can literally see the waste in what remains today from archaeological sites. So with industrialization and the globalisation of the food system came new waste streams, and food was beginning to be a commodity that once bought and consumed was thrown away rather than kind of cyclically grown, preserved, consumed, and then the leftovers recycled at home. So I'm jumping ahead again in history to 1939, and of course the World Wars, by which time Britain's food system had, it continued to globalise, and ordinary people were becoming more and more distant from the production of their food and were becoming therefore more wasteful. But of course, when World War hit, wasting food suddenly became this issue of national survival. Imports were cut off and the labour force in Britain severely limited. So past culinary treats like imported oranges, sugary Turkish delights were abruptly out of reach. I think it's interesting to think that when he was writing The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe in 1939, C.S. Lewis wistfully remembered Turkish delights so fondly that he imagined Edmund would give up his family for bites of their exotic flavour. Back in the real world, food shortages were at their most severe over here in the winter of 1940 to 41. And the Ministry of Food commissioned a series of posters with these kind of snappy maxims and directions. So you can see this one, better potluck with Churchill today than humble pie under Hitler tomorrow. Don't waste food. And of course you can work out which pan is Hitler from the iconic moustache. So there was a huge amount of propaganda that was published to get people to stop wasting their food. And it was even made illegal by 1940 to willfully waste food or drink that could have been consumed by people. Of course, rationing was introduced in 1940, and by 1942, almost all foods were rationed. Those on the home front were, of course, implored to make do with their rations, substituting ingredients with what was available and by growing their own vegetables as much as possible. Here's Dr. Carrot, who would skip across many a Ministry of Food leaflet, encouraging carrot eating, especially among children. There's lots and lots of lovely recipes again that I share in the book. Things like making a sugar-free carrot cake, but really an actual proper carrot cake, not like a sugary one that we have today, a proper carrot cake to get around shortages in sugar. Potatoes too were a saving grace during wartime, easy to grow, a good source of carbohydrates, very nutrient dense. And the Ministry of Food employs another anthropomorphized food character called Potato Pete to instruct housewives on how to make best use of their homegrown potatoes. Again, there's loads of wonderful recipes, things like Irish potato bread, which was also known as fadge, and potato scones for a treat if you did have a bit of sugar. Housewives would make mock versions of their favorite dishes, like mock fish cakes with potatoes, or infamously, murky, which was a shortening for mock turkey, popularized in the Christmas of 1941, made by stuffing the leg of mutton with sausage meat. Any leftovers were always put to use, so crumbs or stale bread were reimagined into crumb fudge, for example. Again, this is my recreation from one of the recipes in the book. Completely delicious, actually. Seemingly quite indulgent, I thought, although it would have been a bit of a treat to be able to make that. And kitchen leftovers that couldn't be eaten were also sought after. So things like discarded bones, which were rich in phosphorus needed for soil health, were actually a vital weapon of war, according to one poster. There would have been a specialized bone collector or dustman who would come round and who could process the bones into fertilizer or soap. And it's very similar in the US. So Minnie Mouse and Pluto were conscripted for films that encouraged housewives to save leftover fats from cooking to be used. They could be used to make explosives, could be used to make fertilizers, and even glue for aeroplane manufacture. In another World War II campaign, we have this wonderful winking pig who waves one trotter, resting his other hand on a bin labelled pig food. We want your kitchen waste. In London, the discarded food scraps were known as Wembley pudding or Tottenham pudding on account of the location of the factories where waste was converted into pig feed. And they were kind of well known because they, of course, emitted quite a lot of smell. But the task of collecting food waste to feed these pigs was taken over by the Women's Voluntary Service in the UK. And you can see this lovely photo from 1943 of some women collecting the community's food waste bins for that purpose. And school children too were recruited as what they were known as junior salvage stewards or cogs to encourage their local communities to save waste for reuse in the war effort. And I won't read it all out, but in the 1941, the Ministry of Food published this morale boosting poem, which, essentially says the housewives were helping to win the war through preserving their waste, reusing their waste. And it's true that by 1943, 31,000 tons of food waste were being saved every week, which was enough to sustain 210,000 pigs. Of course, therefore, providing nutritious meat ultimately as well. So food waste warriors, women especially on the home front, really did help to win the war. And finally, I want to go into the post-war era. At first, of course, thrifty food habits of the war continued, and rationing too actually only ended in 1953. As part of the book, I spoke to some lovely people locally to me who remember those days. So Anne from Chippenham, which is just a nearby town to where I live in Bristol, was born in 1945 at the end of the war. and her sister Sue, so 6 years older than her. And like most of from this time, they grew up without a fridge. A fridge for the household was an American invention, which only took its place in the majority of UK households in the 1970s. Instead, they had a stone slab on the floor in their larder and a meat safe, which was like a small wooden cabinet with mesh sides that allowed air to circulate while keeping out insects. Nothing was ever wasted, Anne told me of that time. She said bottles of milk were kept in in a shaded area with a cold bucket of water in the warmer months, or they'd be lined up on the windowsill in cold weather with a stone on top of each of the foil to stop the birds pecking through to get to the cream. Their mother shopped practically every day at individual shops like the grocer, the butcher, the baker, etc. And leftovers were quickly used up in the kitchen to prevent them from going off. So leftover milk became batter, potato peelings fed the chickens in the backyard, for example. Ice lollies, gosh, we thought we were rich, Anne told me, remembering what it was like to have a fridge for the first time as an adult. It's no exaggeration to say that the introduction of artificial refrigeration changed the lives of ordinary people, especially women, who were born in this post-war era. And a then youthful Mary Berry, who is a kind of icon here of the food world in the UK, said to the housewife in her popular freezer cookery book of 1972 that if you have a fridge or freezer, you are released from the frenzy of work that ties you to the kitchen. Now, the introduction of these gadgets, along with other things like televisions, cars, was emblematic of the rise of consumer wealth in Britain after the war as the economy recovered. Ordinary people had more access to food than ever before, and between the early 1960s and the early 90s, it got much cheaper, falling in essentially 50% in price. So it's a huge change, era of rapid change. Britain had spent the past century enjoying the economic power and benefits of its colonial empire. But after years of global war, the dynamic changed, and it was America that emerged as the strongest post-war economy. At the time, the US actually accounted for 2/3 of the world's industrial production, and this naturally translated into cultural power. So US made cans of food that supplied allied armies were found across the globe, along with cans of Coca-Cola, for example. And there's lovely or interesting reports, at least, of Europeans seeing these American soldiers consuming Coca-Cola and being completely enthralled by it, and sort of seeing that wealthier way of life and kind of wanting to be a part of it. The Marshall Plan, which I'm sure you know, sent billions and billions, hundreds of billions really, into the Western Europe's recovery, was granted from America only on the condition that people in Europe be exposed to, promote the new American way of life. And as well as following America's lead with the introduction of the fridge, the UK soon adopted another American invention, which was the supermarket. I know it's very contested, but the first supermarket, I would say, was named King Cullen and opened in Queens in New York in 1930, using the slogan "Pile it high, sell it low." And in the UK, our first supermarket was in South London in 1951. American fast food also took root in this era, with the first McDonald's established in the US in 1948, and Burger King 1961. We got KFC in the UK in 1964. And all this together equated to a revolution in food and in food waste habits. Although fridges and freezers could reduce waste by preserving it, they also led to consumer behaviour changes that increased it. So if in the 1950s and 60s you'd carefully plan your meals. Fridges and freezers meant you could stock up on food that you might end up actually not needing, not using before it goes off. Um, and I think that's true today, right? Who among us hasn't pulled, a moldy tomato or two from the back of a fridge, or forgotten a ready meal in the freezer or something, because we end up buying more from supermarkets in bulk, leaving more to go to waste. Eating out became possible, um, with all the waste that kind of not cooking for yourself entails. Um, you know, not not knowing what you want, if you don't like certain ingredients, or making too much than your appetite, etc., etc. And as I've already said, this meant that food waste doubled in Britain between 1939 and 1976. So at the same time, though, that this throwaway society was being forged, activists were trying to counteract it. The new environmentalist movement was inspired by the American ecologist Rachel Carson's influential book, Silent Spring. And she was particularly fearful of new artificial pesticides like DDT. Um, she imagined that if the food system continued developing as it was, we would face this kind of bleak future of springs that were clouded in what she says is a strange stillness, would have withered crops, unhatched chicks, empty streams, and quiet in place of the joyful morning chorus. At the same time, new strains of crops were being produced that were super efficient and seemingly therefore less wasteful per area of land, but were reliant on these new pesticides and fungicides, and therefore highly damaging to the environment. And there's an example there of a new strain of rice, IR8. At least we will be feeding people, even if we are destroying their soils and poisoning them to do it, Michael Alabi said in the newly established Ecologist magazine in 1970. And another huge target of the new environmentalist movement was landfill sites. During the 70s and 80s, public awareness and fear that was growing that landfill sites were being filled up, and that the country was actually running out of space for new ones. Bulky plastic, glass, paper, and other containers exploded in volume in the supermarket age, and refillable glass bottles were slowly phased out. And you can see in this picture, this was the first public process of Friends of the Earth UK in 1971, where they dumped 1,500 Schweppes glass bottles outside the London HQ of the company after the company announced that it would be moving to disposable bottles. And I think that's emblematic of the change that was happening in that time. And it wasn't successful, I should say. They carried on. Plastic packaging, of course, in particular, was becoming a problem. Debris was being found in oceans and causing some alarm. But the rise of plastics continued, and by 1992, nearly 10% of household waste was made up of plastic containers. Food waste itself, of course, produces huge amounts of methane when it's just left in landfill sites, a gas which is 25% more damaging to the Earth's atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And even in urban areas over here, like in Birmingham and Manchester, where the councils did find some value in collecting food waste post-war, they still only did so into the early 1960s. Yeah, so change really was very gradual. In 1996, the UK was still sending 90% of its waste to landfill, and then only 5% was being recycled. It was only in 1993 that we had the first local authority to offer household recycling at all. And it wasn't until 2006 that Bristol, where I'm from, became the first major UK city to introduce separate household food waste recycling collections. Only in 2010 that the government made it mandatory for all local authorities to provide curbside recycling for at least 2 types of materials. And it's still here. Again, I'd be interested to hear what it's like over there, but it's still here, not universally a universal provision to have food waste recycling across the country, even though the government, successive governments, keep making promises that it will be. So by the 1970s, then, food waste was an integral part of the modern, hyperproductive, globalized, industrialized food system. And as we move further and further away from the homegrown food and preservation of our rural ancestors, reliant instead on cheap, mass produced products shipped across the globe, food waste became easier in the West. And it was starting to be seen as the incredibly significant environmental issue that it is today. Um, and maybe I'll just read this because I think it's the part of a poem by Robert Waller, who was a writer for The Ecologist. He said, "Food can be kept for the day of the resurrection to greet the saints with the saviour of baked beans, but where by then will the tins have all been stacked? Mountains of tins festooned with putrefied labels, mighty plateaux moulded from kitchen waste, shoals of tins floating in the seas, pesticide cans of indestructible poisons, killing the fish and drifting back to the rivers." So we've seen how times of crisis, like the poor harvest of the 1590s, the world wars, and also the coronavirus pandemic, where I started this talk, have sporadically reminded us of the true value of food when it suddenly becomes unavailable to us. We need now to act globally on food waste to help solve this impending climate crisis. But also, as this brief history has shown, this is also a deeply moral issue, not just an environmental issue. It's one that reflects the divide between the rich and the poor. So, like the poor who waited at the Tudor gates for the scraps from great feasts, £500 a year is wasted needlessly on perfectly edible food in the UK, on average in each of our households each year. While in 2022, 14% of UK adults were in food insecurity. And of course, we should think of this on a global scale. So wasted food could go into the mouths of the 842 million people globally who are living in hunger. So studying the history of food waste, I think, tells us much more about the changing value or lack thereof that we as a society have placed on food, but also on the other people and the planet who are affected by food waste. So if we are what we eat, our cultures, our moral values are equally defined by what we don't eat. And that's the end. Thank you.
How wonderful. How wonderful. Before you turn off your slideshow, in the Tudor period, you had a picture where there was like a round disc.
Yes.
Maybe you could show that, but was that a fruit leather? If it wasn't,
almost, yeah. It's a similar type of
there.
Yeah. They'd call them marmalades. But yes, essentially it's mushed fruit with lots of sugar that's been preserved past the boiling point, and then it becomes hardened.
So was it flattened and dried then?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And then preserve them, make them in these lovely molds, and then give them as gifts.
Here's a question that was asked, and perhaps you've answered it, but nonetheless, Madeline was inquiring, please address how waxed paper and plastic packaging has compounded food waste. In a sense, you've kind of answered that, but maybe there's something more you wish to say.
Let me think. So about plastic. Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the wider. I think it's part of it shows how the whole system, not just food itself, but kind of how we present our food is seen as sort of disposable, right? So I think when you go to the shop, it's sort of you have, or the supermarket, I suppose, you have the impression that it's all kind of cheap, it's all disposable, And as I, mentioned, this is again quite a modern issue of just mass production of these plastics, and everything's, it was when they first came out, people wanted that, it was seen as really modern, but ultimately it's just a huge part of the climate problem as well.
So what's the current UK policy regarding recycling plastic and food waste?
Yeah, so everyone does have to have access to some type of container recycling in the UK, but the food waste recycling is really, I think, surprisingly lacking. So we've had the last government, the Conservative government, so when did they leave now? I don't know. This year anyway, we switched the other side. But they promised that we would all be entitled to, no matter where you lived in the country, food waste recycling by 2023. And then as 2023 got closer, they moved it to from 2023, and then it didn't happen. And now we've got a new government, and they have made another promise. I think they're now saying by 2026. So we will see if that actually happens. Of course, it's more complicated than that, because what happens to that food waste, that depends on what local governments do, what contracts they have with local processors. So here it tends to go to anaerobic digesters, so it can be made into like fertilizers and oils and things like that, but they're seen as problematic because, to some people, because they oftentimes have sought out animal grain or something to kickstart the process, so they actually sort of buy into the waste industry, I suppose. So that's kind of what as a standard would be done with domestic food waste. But I think that, of course, there's the more important point, I suppose. That's really good, we need that, but the more important point is that we shouldn't be wasting as much food in the first place, and that's a much more complicated issue, right, that involves individual behaviors, but ultimately change on a governmental and even a global level to kind of change how the system works.
Jacqueline Ottman, who we talked about earlier, prior to opening the discussion today, she's going to do the talk on the meat packing in New York.
Yeah.
And her, I'm talking Eleanor from what was it? Well, her from the internet. But you've never
From
met in right. Well,
yeah.
I have many friends from the internet.
Yeah.
But she said, "Thank you so much. Do you have any insights about how we might rebrand leftovers? They seem so polarizing. One either loves them or hates them."
So you mean kind of within
You know what?
within
Let me get Jacqueline. Jacqueline, I'm going to have you unmute because I know you're dying to talk about this topic. So not dying, but you're eager. I think you should be able to unmute. Oh, I guess I was asking the next person. Okay, now try it.
Okay, I did it. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you so much,
There you go.
Catherine. Hi, Dr. Barnett. Nice to finally see you
Nice to
in
see
person
you.
after our emails. Yeah, so I've been doing research on leftovers, and Catherine and other people from Chicago know I'm always the one to ask the leftovers question, regardless of what the talk is about. So what I was getting at is leftovers are polarizing. People seem to love them, like probably everybody almost on this call, likely. And then there are people who say, no, I don't like leftovers. But I listened into the Refed conference this
Oh
past
yes.
June, and they said that leftovers and date labels are the two biggest drivers of residential food waste. And residential food waste is bigger than house restaurants and everybody
Yes,
else
it
out of
is.
home.
Yes, it is.
So what can we do to get people more interested in leftovers and looking forward to actually looking in the fridge and bringing the leftovers to the fore and eating them up?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't think I've got the answer, essentially. But I would just comment that I agree that it's a very polarizing thing, um, because I think people are scared of leftovers because it implies kind of culinary knowledge, I suppose, right? And um, people who have less money, who are oftentimes less educated, are the people who probably need to know more about using up their leftovers, but are, from a financial point of view, but are kind of scared off, I think, by it being presented as a kind of, complex culinary thing. um, uh, that people who are only great cooks do. Um, so I think the answer, well, if one part of the answer is trying to connect to um, people who and present it more as like a financial decision, I suppose, um, and offer recipes that are cheap and easy. And ultimately, we're getting into a wider issue, which is about education and getting people of all kind of economic classes involved in touching, tasting, cooking, the production of their food, and therefore not being kind of like intimidated about what do I do because I've got, a few tomatoes left over and I don't know, an onion or whatever, um, but actually know how to use that food to turn it into something. And I think, it can feel like quite a depressing topic, but I personally felt, or one of the things that made me feel really optimistic about it, at least here, is that a lot of the work that local community groups do here to get children, younger people, often from more disadvantaged backgrounds, to get involved with growing their own food from a young age and just having that familiarity with it.
Right, right. I mean, how
Um,
many
yeah,
teenagers do we know who don't know how to reheat a slice of pizza?
well,
No.
exactly. Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm still looking for the numbers, but I would not be surprised to see a way downward a decrease in the number of children that we're actually teaching to cook. I think we're teaching more children to code computers in school than
yeah,
cook.
yeah, which is, well, it's going to say it's
Both
a
are
shame. We need to do
important.
both. We need to do both, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not forget that connection. I mean, we all need to eat. It's so important. And like I'm kind of making the point of, we're just getting more and more distance from those hands-on um, production of our own food, and therefore we don't value it. We're not connected to it, and we waste it.
Right.
Um, but
Thank
on
you.
a kind of personal note, I do hope that this angle of actually exploring some of the historical recipes that people use is another way of getting people connected, right, with food, with their leftovers, because um, I think there's so many exciting historical recipes that we should bring back and experiment with, um, and learn from all these wonderful women in the past who left behind all their cookery notes.
Well, Elaine takes a rather, I would say, contemporary approach. She calls it chopped Elaine's kitchen edition when I'm repurposing leftovers. I mean, that's great, you know, it's just, it sells the idea better, doesn't it, than leftovers? And you know, we have Thanksgiving here in the United States in a few weeks. And I began my Thanksgiving preparation by defrosting a 10-pound ham, roasting it, and a family of three, which is what we are with varying degrees of appetites. We've been working our way through ham, and I make it something interesting every day. Carrie Shug, he pointed out, he says, I still eat fruits and vegetables that are a bit brown or otherwise beyond what all of my friends will eat.
Mhm.
Um, Anne Howard said, we tend to think of leftovers as a consumer problem, but it's also a commercial and industrial issue. Can you speak to how producers and retailers addressed this issue historically?
Oh, historically. Um, so, uh,
It's a big question.
yeah, sorry, yeah, because it's retailers produce, but so maybe just to take supermarkets, until the the early 21st century, supermarkets were discarding, you know, everything, and the same with restaurants or cafe chains and things like that. So something that went, 5 seconds over its best before, um, things that the label had torn slightly, um, where there'd been a slight spillage of something else onto the label, just for aesthetic reasons, things like that, and they would just throw them into the big um, uh, dustbins uh, out back, and they would even pour on chemicals and things to stop people going in and taking the leftovers from the supermarkets or cafes and so on, because they were worried that if you realize you could get quite a lot of this very good food, fine food for free, that people wouldn't shop in their shops. But that's something that's really been changed now in the UK, at least through a lot of campaigning, and now there's a huge network in place, which means that supermarkets donate what's left to certain charities that then distribute it to people in need, or whatever. Um, so, and I mean, in the US, there was the movement of free cycling, veganism, all of that, dumpster diving, I think you'd call it in the US. Is that right?
That's one of the names.
Yeah. Okay. With well, it was started in the US really in the kind of late 20th century, and it was really seen as very illegal, and people were prosecuted, and there's an interesting history there. But like I say, now I think there too it's got much better. um what else to say? Sorry, what was the rest of the question?
She goes, we tend to think of leftovers as a consumer problem, but it's also a commercial and industrial issue. Can you speak to how producers and retailers address this issue historically, which in a sense you have done?
Okay, yeah, I think the other thing maybe to say is that yeah, so a huge modern issue is supermarket dominance in the selling of food. So again, until really recently, um, and it's still happening, supermarkets had so much power over the producers. So they could cancel contracts. They'd say, "Oh, we expect that we're going to sell, I don't know, 500 um, apples. So we're putting in this order to the producers," and then the producers, for fear of not wanting to disappoint that contract, would produce, let's say, 1,000 apples, and then it would come up to the day before when they're already packaged, whatever, and the supermarket would actually look at its sales and what it had left, and then it would say, actually, we want 20 from you or something, and then the producer is left with that a surplus, and all of the loss in income, uh, and what they end up doing with it would be wasting it, letting it go moldy. So now there's been a lot of work in the UK at least, to get supermarkets to sign up to kind of better practice, and they're not allowed to cancel their orders anymore. So that's a huge way in which I think, yeah, the communication between producers and sellers is getting better. But it's still a big problem that these huge chains dominate, and they just have so much power that it's hard even for governments to kind of get them to listen. And I think that's where actually consumers can make an impact, because if these big companies think that we care about things like that, they do make change. But if they think that it's not worth their time, they're not going to do it.
Madeline commented, she says, our whole food system is predicated on eating processed food and not knowing how to prepare foods.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I used to be a master gardener volunteer, and we were always being pressed, and they wanted us to donate our homegrown fruits and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, it makes no sense until you offer a food program showing them how to cook these fruits and vegetables. And I'm talking 30 years ago, I said this, and that's happening. A lot of these things are coming with an education component. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm the one that got it going, because it makes complete sense what I said. So, what have you. Well, slightly, well, whatever. NPR reported that the new Trump administration aims to introduce a health initiative. This will be interesting to see coming from our next president, whose diet consists of Big Macs and fish fillets. And by the way, I was on, myself and one other person, we were on a television program, and they tried to at least frame a question to make me look like a food snob. And I said, I proudly go to McDonald's. And I do. So whatever, we'll see what happens. I have a question going back to your talk about buttermilk.
Okay.
And being a fermented product. And I was always, because you see buttermilk, what's left is very thin. And I thought the product we were getting in the grocery store, which is a fermented product, was not necessarily the same product that was in the past. I thought it was just a thin milk. And now I believe I perhaps was wrong.
Oh.
What do you think?
I'm not sure.
Okay, then don't worry about it. It's something I'll look into it, and I'll tell you what I learned.
Let me know. Yeah, I'm not sure what is being sold.
I know some people in the dairy business, so I will ask them.
Yeah.
And find out what they know.
Yeah.
I think we've run out of questions, which is just great. And it was a pleasure to see you. I'm glad we had a good audience, especially when we had to postpone from the last time.
Yes.
But I'm so glad we could make this happen, and I'm so glad my hosts here in Dongola helped me make this happen from my side today.
Yeah, that was an organizational feat. So thank you very much.
You know what? I have somebody who goes traveling quite a bit, and he's often saying, I can't do it, I'm in Asia. Yes, you can. You just have to get up early.
That's the good thing about the modern world, hey.
Okay, and if there's anything you missed, I'm going to send you the chat. Well, thank you very much. And by the way, you don't know this, but she's going to have a baby in a few months. So thank you for taking. Yeah, well, I appreciate your coming, and I hope you have an excellent birth.
Thank you very much. Fingers crossed.
Yes, of course. All right. Good night, or good afternoon, and have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye. And you have a nice evening, Eleanor.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.